Hello, and welcome to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit.
There are so many questions these days. What's the best way to invest in my nonprofit's impact? How do I lead my team through today's societal changes? How do I increase donor retention rate, hit fundraising goals, avoid burnout, stay on mission, and still make it to the grocery store before dinner time? It all feels a little bit overwhelming. Well, today we've got a guest who's here to help us answer a few of these and hopefully change the way we approach relationships for the benefit of the whole change-making sector. Andrew Olsen is Senior Vice President of Fundraising Solutions at Dickerson Bakker and a close friend of Funraise. And today he's here to blow your mind. As a nonprofit consultant myself, I can relate to a lot of what Andrew is sharing, and in fact have explored the intersection of leadership, nonprofits, change-making, and culture on his podcast as well. But this conversation was different. Andrew dropped a bomb on me right at the end, a mindset shift that turned everything upside down. I encourage you to listen as Andrew intentionally leads us down a path of long-term donor-organization relationship evolution, and then changes the game with one sentence. When you're done, listen again with that one key takeaway and prepare to unlock answers like never before.
It is your number one priority to ensure that your business can continue to deliver on its mission, whether it's this year, next year, and beyond.
So we're creating this inclusive environment, building between diverse communities to ensure that our young people can thrive.
I'm always so baffled when I do webinars. There's always somebody at the end who raises their hand and says, I'm the development director. Should I have access to the budget? I'm always like, yes, you've got to know that.
The best thing you can ever do as a nonprofit leader is spend as much money as possible on your story.
Then you're doing it wrong.
Okay.
That is unacceptable, and that is not the way to run a board.
The best thing that we can do is just raise as much money as possible and then give it to the people around the world.
If you're going to be sustainable, you have to have a multi-channel strategy to reach all of these different generations of donors however they want to be reached.
One of the principal values that we carry as an organization is to lift grace over guilt. And we believe that grace is the greatest agent for change that anyone can ever experience.
We all need each other in terms of other nonprofits working together to solve things.
The more nonprofits can give their donor base that experience of the impact that's being made on the ground level, there's nothing else that you have to give someone. This is Nonstop Nonprofit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Nonstop Nonprofit Podcast. This is your host, David Schwab, Head of Growth and Marketing at Funraise, and today I have the honor of having my friend and mentor, Andrew Olsen, joining us. Andrew, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Hey, David. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm super excited about this. My name's Andrew Olsen. I've been a fundraiser, 23 years-ish now. Just makes me old. I'm the SVP of Fundraising Solutions over at Dickerson Bakker. We're a fundraising consultancy that serves ministries and other nonprofits. We do everything from new donor acquisition to capital campaigns, executive search, and grant services for organizations. And, I'm just focusing on helping organizations find better ways to raise money and to increase the level of generosity with their supporters.
That's awesome. Well, Andrew, that's a real nice lead into what I wanted to talk with you about today. I know you and I have talked at length about this subject. I had a chance to join you on your podcast. We'll link in the show notes, we'll link to that episode. But we had a chance to talk, and one of the conversation points that we got on was this general note of there just has to be a better way to do this. And so it's kind of what I wanted to talk about with you today, and more than anything, dig into a few different aspects of what it's like to be a nonprofit leader, a fundraiser, an organization that wants to not only survive the current climate, but thrive through it. And I know that got a lot of traction and conversation around it after the podcast we did together earlier this year went up. So maybe we can just kind of sit in that a little bit. I think the first question I have is probably the broadest one for us, is like, as you've been sitting with nonprofit leaders and helping organizations look at the climate we're in, both cultural and economic, what are some of the things that are keeping leaders up at night? What are some of the things that are like, hey, I'm seeing this, I don't know how to approach it? What are some of those conversations like?
Yeah. So earlier today, I did a webinar for the Citygate Network, which is the network of rescue missions and other organizations that are primarily serve homeless and communities and folks who are in some level of addiction or addiction recovery. And one of the first questions that was asked by the 70 or so leaders that were on the call was, how do we find good talent? How do we retain fundraisers? And what do we need to do differently? Because it seems like we've got a revolving door of fundraisers in our organizations. And so that's one of the biggest ones that we're seeing right now. And we see it in our executive search practice, but we also see it across everything else that we do, whether it's, a grant writer or a major gift fundraiser or somebody who runs, digital and direct marketing. The landscape for hiring right now is crazy. And so many organizations need great talent, and because of what's gone on, whether it's pandemic or the economy, I don't even know, all the different layers. There's just such a migration right now happening on the talent side. In fact, I posted last week a job rec. Actually, our team did for my staff for a fairly junior level coordinator type role, and we got over 300 applications for it. Right, so imagine the competition at any organization, and imagine, that with that, there's really two categories, right? There's great fundraisers, and then there's everybody else. And so the great fundraisers make up such a small percentage of that audience, right? And they're probably not looking for work right now, or at least they're not active searchers, right? They have the benefit of recruiters and other people coming to them trying to poach them. So what we talk a lot about is, it comes down to culture. Right. And so we did a study a year ago. I'll make sure that you get it for the link in the show notes. But we asked fundraisers, particularly we're curious about this retention issue and about the whole narrative of like, oh yeah, fundraisers turn over every 12 to 18 months. Right. What was interesting is we found that largely that's not true. The tenure for a typical fundraiser is actually over 5 years. However, there's a very small cohort of fundraisers who jump every 6 to 12 months. And they throw the average because of the fact that they just they're so migratory. But anyway, the big point in that study was that fundraisers said the number one thing that would help keep them in an organization is a CEO who leaned fully into fundraising. And they weren't saying like the CEO needs to be the chief asker, right? That wasn't the objective.
Right.
What they were saying is, we want a culture where the CEO doesn't say things like, oh, I don't ask for money, that's why I hired those people, right? And they want a CEO or an executive director, whatever the title is, who understands the value and the importance of philanthropy, who helps to create a culture of philanthropy where organization and the people in the organization value engaging with donors and inviting them to give to support the mission of the organization, and where the team feels well-resourced. Right. So that's everything from, do I have budgets to do the things that we need? Do we have, if you're asking me to raise an extra $2 million, have you given me an extra $200,000 to spend to get there? Right. Or whatever the number might be. Are we investing in the technology that's not just good for donor experience, but easy for us to use so we don't bang our head against the wall all day, trying to make something sort of fit in a box that it was never intended to fit in? Or do we have stuff that's really good? So it's those kind of things, right? And what the overwhelming response from fundraisers is if the CEO leans in at that level, we're happy to stay as long as we can, right? So I think that's the number one thing in my mind, and then the other is just this idea and the data point that follows it that we continue to see individual giving decline. Participation rate from individual donors just keeps falling. Association of Fundraising Professionals released something in October of last year showing that the number of active givers who give less than $500 a year had fallen. We've seen the same thing in our own data. We've seen the same thing from a number of different research initiatives over the last couple of years. And what that tells me, it doesn't tell me that we're out of donors, right? There's no lack of money in the world at this point. Inflation being, what it is. Certainly the value of a dollar has declined. But it's that there's a lack of engagement, right? And that donors don't feel like the organizations they support give a rip about them. And I think we're going to see this even more with, as Gen Xers, as millennials, as those cohorts sort of age up and have access to the capital necessary to be charitable, we're going to see that increase because the demands that they've grown up with and the ability to create preference and tell corporate entities, this is how I want you to engage me, is going to create behaviors that I think many nonprofits aren't prepared for. But those are the kind of things that if we don't prepare now and start working in that direction, we're going to get left behind, because I don't think these younger audiences of donors are going to tolerate an old model for too long. I think we're about to start seeing organizations really lose ground if they don't start to think about how they can better engage their supporters.
I think there is just so much to unpack in all of what you just said. I think where I want to start, though, it's really interesting when you're in a room full of nonprofit leaders who are all saying, hey, we have a problem and we're facing crazy headwinds. Their first answer is talent, right? Like from the outside perspective, I'd be like, hey, we need to raise more money. We need to grow our recurring revenue base so we have reliable revenue. We need to go tap into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whatever that is, right? To make ourselves more financially stable. But I think it's interesting that, and maybe a little bit reassuring, that leaders are recognizing, hey, we have a talent problem first, which also probably means they're recognizing we might have a culture problem. One of the things that we've leaned into at Funraise over the last few months is helping with this, right? Being part of the conversation about the nonprofit talent network, talent pool. We just finished and published our job board a few weeks ago, and we've been seeing tremendous engagement there. People looking for jobs in the nonprofit sector, people looking for a community of support to find jobs in the nonprofit sector, but also people looking to talk about what it's actually like to work in the nonprofit sector. So I'm curious, what are some of the things that you've been inspired by or seen done really well by organizations or leaders to either retain their staff? Like you talked about being a leader that leans into fundraising and supporting your staff, or what are some things you've seen organizations do to take steps forward to attract the next generation of talent or retain the next generation of talent?
Yeah. So, I've sat with a lot of CEOs and a lot of boards to have this conversation. And I think the things that I see that make me go, okay, yeah, these people get it, right? It's things like, first of all, does everyone in the organization know what the goal actually is? Right? I mean, as simple and rudimentary as that sounds, there are so many organizations where that conversation is not had fully across the organization. And so, being really clear about the mission, and not just the, sort of capital M mission that we're all about, right? But even hey, this is the mission for the month, right? Or this is the mission for the week. And really communicating that well. Open lines of communication up, down, and across the organization are essential. One of the other things that I see all the time, and I actually am just working with an organization over the last couple of weeks around this, is when you see toxic behavior, that you're quick to address it and root it out and make clear that poor behavior is not acceptable no matter what results the person gets. Because the minute you start to accept bad behavior because someone delivers great results, whether they're a fundraiser or on a program side or whatever, you immediately set a new bar for bad behavior. And you say, I as the leader accept this as long as you deliver other outcomes, right? And that grows in an organization like a cancer. So rooting that out quickly is important. I think leaders who are willing to be authentic and vulnerable really stand to win the day here. And that doesn't mean that you show up every day and you cry and all that kind of stuff, right? But it does mean that you admit when you're wrong, that you admit you don't know everything, and that you invite others to own space in the organization, and that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. When those things are not true, that's the quickest way to get your best people to leave, right? So I think those are the kind of things that I would say, if you do nothing else today, but start to take action on those kind of efforts, as a leader, you will see such a significant impact in the next 90 days by being intentional about those things. It's just so valuable.
So if I'm distilling that and parroting it back, it's as a leader, it's taking intentional steps to be authentic with your people.
Mm-hmm.
Getting real practical, what are a few other things you've seen make a difference for organizations, whether it's from the way they post jobs, where they post jobs, how they talk about themselves, how they speak internally versus externally? I know Dickerson Bakker has a lot of exposure to executive level talent in the nonprofit sector and what is attractive to candidates. So maybe from that perspective, is there anything you're seeing that, catches the high value talent in the sector's eye more than another?
Yeah, so I think some of that does start, you're right, with sort of the, like, before you're even in the door, right? Mm-hmm. So if you, a very clear and concise job description. I saw this morning on LinkedIn, someone else mentioned that, if your job description is 5 pages, there's probably a problem here, right? And I think that's true. I've unfortunately seen some like that, maybe not 5, but even 3 seems excessive. So how simple and clear can you make things, right? The same thing would go for your interview process, right? So I remember early on in my career, I interviewed with a major Christian university for a development job, and there were 8 interviews. And I remember by the 5th thinking, my goodness, what else could I tell you at this point that would make any difference in this conversation, right? So I think that we owe it to candidates to be as efficient with their time as possible, and to not put the burden on them to navigate around our schedules. So if you want 12 people to participate in the interview process, get them all in the room, right? Or schedule, a single day, a couple of hours where you can have a series of brief interviews where a candidate would engage with 3 or 4 people per, and get the opinions that way, rather than dragging something out over time. I talked to somebody yesterday who shared with me that she had a 5 or 7 month process to get her current job. And I just thought, like, man, I don't have the patience for that. I would have checked out at like month 2, right?
Yeah.
And so particularly when the economy is as challenged as it is, like, how can we as leaders assume that, hey, let's just string people along for months while we take our time to decide? We owe it to people to be much more efficient than that. And I always tell people, like, look, the way you experience an organization in the interview process is going to be the way you experience them as an employee. So if you get indicators like that in the interview process, the worst thing you can do is assume, oh, it'll probably be different once I'm there. Right? So I think that's a big one. I think being really clear about compensation, about benefits, about time off, in today's world, about location, and whether it's a fully remote or a hybrid, or am I expected to be in an office? I mean, all those things matter a lot more today than they did 2 years ago. And I think the other thing is organizations that do really well at this talk boldly about their culture, and those that don't probably don't because they probably aren't proud of it.
Right. So these are all really like meaty subjects that I think we could spend the rest of the time we have together digging into. But I do want to, I think, change direction a little bit and unpack maybe a little bit more about the second half of your original answer there, being around the generosity crisis, right? It's a term that's being thrown around a lot in the sector. In fact, I think there was even a book, I've yet to read it myself, but there was a book with that title, right? That was published right around the end of last year, beginning of this year, right?
Yeah, it's a fantastic read. So it's written by 2 brilliant dudes, Nathan Chappell over at Donor Search, and my good friend Brian Crimmins, who's the CEO of Changing Our World. In fact, I'll make sure you get a link because I interviewed them on my podcast, so you can link that as well. But it's really sort of frightening. I mean, their perspective and their point of view is, if you look at the declines in individual donor participation over the last 20 or so years, and you extrapolate that out for the next, 50 years-ish, if nothing changes in the rate of participation decline over that time period, philanthropy as we know it ceases to exist in like 49 years. And, do I think it'll go away entirely? No. But do I think it's going to become a heck of a lot harder for organizations to raise meaningful revenue if they don't change the way that they engage with donors? Absolutely. And, no widget, no ice bucket challenge. I mean, none of these things are going to move the needle, right? It all comes down to how do we build authentic relationships with other human beings and invite them in to be part of a solution versus just saying, stay over here away from me until I need your money, and then let me ring the cash register and get a few bucks and go about my way. Right. So if we don't change the way that we behave because we're in control of that conversation, we can't expect to do any better in the future.
So I want to unpack this a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think the first thing we need to address is okay, let's take on the mindset of the nonprofit leader going, is this actually a problem for me? I mean, the general blanket answer is yes, this is a problem for the industry. But let's look at my organization. My revenue has been consistent. And in fact, it's up a little year over year. Obviously, we had the pandemic. We had a big boom that year. We're down a little bit from that, but we've seen revenue growth. We're getting more donors in. Our bottom line's fine. Is this really a problem we need to pay attention to? So that's the mindset we're in. How do I peel back the layers as a leader to see if this is affecting me?
Yeah. So I think the first thing that I'd suggest is that you start to look at your churn rate, right? So you're right. Revenue is flat to slightly up. Now, when you factor in inflation at what it is today, most organizations are actually down from a real dollars perspective, right? But when you look at the churn and what we're seeing with retention and participation rates, what you see is that lower level donors, which make up the bulk of most donor files, there's actually a much steeper decline in those audiences. And for most organizations, the top 2 to 5% of their donors are carrying and covering that loss. So from a pure cash flow perspective, you're not wrong, right? However, it takes 1 or 2 donors to pass away or to become frustrated with your organization or simply to move. And immediately you have a cash issue, right? Because I was looking at a donor file a couple of days ago, 80% of their revenue comes from 54 giving units on their file. When one of those donors has a life event that alters their giving, all of a sudden that creates a 7-figure hole for this organization, right? And no amount of extra acquisition in a given year is going to fix that, right? So I think this means that organizations have to stop looking at top line metrics and they have to stop looking at upfront trends, response rates, average gifts, gross revenue. Like, you've got to throw those metrics out the window. And you've got to look at things like, what's my net long-term value? What's my value per donor annually? And what are my retention rates by life cycle so that I can understand, if I've just gotten a bunch of new donors in, that might skew my retention rate. It might make it actually look like I've got more donors than I do. When if you isolate the multi-year donors, which are typically tend to be the most valuable, you might have a retention problem there. And a lot of organizations are seeing that right now. So I would say dig deeper. Like, the worst thing we can do is take information at face value and not ask questions about it. Because if you do that, you're going to set yourself up for failure in the next 12, 18, 24 months. And then, I think the other big challenge around this is thinking that all donors are equal. I sat in a room once with one of the world's top 5 charities, and they said to me, we have no desire to treat high wealth donors or high capacity donors any different than anyone else. We want to treat everyone like a major donor. And I said, great, we can fully get behind that. However, at some point that model has to be riled up a little bit, because you can't afford to put a gift officer in a room with a person who gives you $5 a quarter when you have someone else who gives you $500,000 a quarter. Like the trade-off cannot be equal there, right? So yes, do things to build relationship and to create engagement with every donor and treat them well. But at some point you have to say, from a pure investment perspective, I've got to focus on this handful, typically, of donors who can move the needle the most for us. And I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting that you bend over backwards and you only focus on those people and you let them run your organization. I know there's a sort of a growing narrative around the risk of that, and I fully get that. But at the same time, when someone can make such a meaningful impact, you have to spend some extra investment there. It's
Right.
just a matter of how the math works.
Right. I think it's so important for it's almost organizations and leaders need to do the hard work right now to go deeper than they've ever had to go to uncover like, hey, where is the leak in my system? Because everything may look okay, but if we just let okay be okay for another 2 or 3 years, we may not be able to right the ship anymore.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things you've been talking about has reminded me of conversations I've had with a few different guests on our podcast, Erica Carley and David Bowden, both leaders at their respective organizations, but both shared a commitment to, and it's something you've been talking about, is treating your donors like people. David talked a little bit about changing the perspective. They don't call donors at their organization, they call them partners. And that's not just a name for a sustainer, right? That's everyone who makes a gift to the organization is a partner because they are invested in their movement. And Erica had instilled a culture at her organization to prioritize personal touch points with their donors at any caliber of donor. But also, like you were talking about, not going so far that you lose track of your overall mission or your overall objective by doing these things. But what are some of the ways as leaders in organizations we could start making the shift in our culture from a traditional perspective where, yes, donors are valuable. Yes, donors are important. Saying that, but to actually believing like, these donors are people, right? What I heard when we talked with David Bowden, one of the things that I thought was so interesting is they were facing this seemingly insurmountable challenge. They had an incredible opportunity to accelerate the growth of their organization tenfold in a few months because of a partnership that was presented to them, but they did not have the infrastructure to support that. So first of all, I was impressed with the fact that he recognized, hey, I don't have the infrastructure to support this, so I'm going to go address it. But a lot of it was their back-end technology for their website and how they distribute content. And he's like, I need a 7-figure investment to fix my cybersecurity issue. I don't have one now, but if I go here, I will. And he knew exactly which donor on file to call to say, hey, I have a cybersecurity issue and I need an investment to fix it. And I know you actually care about cybersecurity. Like, he knows his donors so well, his partners so well. He's like, not only can I go to my partners and ask for help with this thing, but like, I know which donor cares about cybersecurity of the hundreds of thousands of people who are partners with us. Like, I thought that was really cool. So just with that context, like that framework, how can a leader start to take practical steps forward to shift the culture of their organization to treat donors, treat partners as people?
Yeah. So I think an interesting data point that underpins this thinking for us is last summer, I think, the Barna Group did some research around generosity and giving. And when they asked donors why they gave, you have the traditional assumptions, right? I gave because someone asked me. I gave because I saw a need. I gave because of, all these various different reasons. The single largest motivator and reason that people gave for why they are charitable is because it aligned with their identity, right? So they saw themselves as charitable people and generous people. And because of that, they give. So I think the first thing that we can do to do this right is to think about what it means to actually see your donors, right? So in the example that you gave, David was able to call that donor because he first took the time to see that donor, right? Mm-hmm. And to understand what motivates them, what excites them, why they give, and how that aligns with what he's up to. So if an organization is, and we see this a lot, particularly with large organizations that run really robust and kind of massive direct marketing programs, right? At some point, the donor is just an ID in the CRM, right? Mm-hmm. Unless they're the top 100 donors, right? And then you might know their names. But if you can get past that and start to actually learn about those supporters, and one of the best ways to do that is through donor surveys, and not just a survey to increase response to an appeal, right? Because there's plenty of that kind of stuff that happens that never actually makes it back to any kind of actionable intelligence that a gift officer or a development team can work from. But actually asking donors what motivates them, what part of your mission is most exciting to them, why they first gave, if there's anybody in their life who has encouraged them to be generous. I mean, a number of different really important questions. And then you actually capture that data and you do something with it. Like that's almost at this point table stakes for developing relationships. And then I think the other one is listening to what might otherwise be considered random noise. So if I send out 30 solicitations a year and particular set of donors only respond to 2, and those 2 happen to be about the same topic, then gosh, maybe I should apply a flag in the CRM that says, David really likes this program. When we serve up solicitations, let's not send him this other crap, and let's focus on the program that he invests in, right? Things like that, where we're actually building a data set and some intelligence, and then turning around and using it so that the donor feels seen and feels heard and feels like they're more than just a transaction ID or an ATM, because that's where you start to create opportunities that really work well, not just to serve your mission, but to serve your donor. The other thing I think about is, if we're honest with ourselves, asking a donor to give from their credit card or their checkbook is the worst thing for most donors, because it does not benefit them from a financial perspective at all, right? It actually harms them. And particularly the higher net worth and the higher, the larger the gift, the worse it is for a donor to give cash or credit card. So, one other area where we can really lean in with donors to show them that they matter is to start talking to them about how they can give from their wealth and assets and why that's beneficial to them. Certainly it's beneficial to us, right? All the data supports the idea that it's good for a charity to get asset-based gifts, but it's actually really good for the donor to give that way as well, because then they can fulfill their charitable purpose, but they can also receive a personal benefit. And most donors don't do it to get the personal benefit, but if we're talking about building deep relationships, like, why wouldn't I try to do something that also benefits you? It's just silly not to.
Right. Well, it's almost the same mindset of like, when I go to make a gift, I'm not going to get my wallet out and give the little bit of cash that I actually carry. I'm going to get my phone out and make a gift online, because I can put my email in, and I know I'm going to be able to get my tax receipt at the end of the year.
Yep.
The motivation for me to give is not because of the tax benefit, but the tax benefit is something that I have in mind when I give, to make sure that that's accounted for. And like, even more so when you're giving 6, 7, sometimes 8-figure asset-based gifts, there's a huge implication to a donor's, at that point, a donor's portfolio.
Yep.
That you as an organization, you're no longer just a gift receiver, you are an investment partner. And you are like, you then can become not just part of their philanthropic strategy, but their overall investment strategy, which completely changes the mindset of how they think about you, how they invest with you, how they partner with you, probably even how they network with you. Because then you're probably talking about opening the door to many more opportunities for introductions to people just like them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, once you're at that level, what we see time and again in the capital campaign work and the major gift work that we do is that one of the best ways to retain a high net worth donor is to ask them to refer you to other people like them, right? Because once they endorse you like that, the likelihood that they're going to walk away is pretty slim.
Right. So I think there continues to be so much here to dig into and unpack. But as we think about what I want to talk about next is kind of a little bit of a pivot, but also maybe the right pivot here. So, and bringing us back to the overall topic of our conversation here, there just has to be a better way. So we talked about, like, how do we approach the talent issues that are impacting the generosity crisis? How do we become a culture that prioritizes fundraising and investing in our people? Then how do we think differently and take steps forward? But let's talk really just on the head. There has to be a better way to do this. Like, we see so often organizations are siloed, and at Funraise, we are talking with fundraising leaders and organizational leaders all the time, and we typically we have a very specific piece of software that serves a very specific department at an organization, and so usually the line item to cover our software comes out of a very specific line item out of a very specific budget, and organizations be like, I just don't have it in the budget this year. And we're like, but there's so much more potential, right? To tap into. And one of my colleagues, Jenny Flack, gave a great talk at the Nonprofit Marketing Summit earlier this year, where she talked about opportunity cost, right? Where sure, you may not have the exact dollar and cent budget to cover this, but what are you leaving on the table by not doing this thing? And I'm using Funraise as an example. I'm not saying that has to be the first thing anyone does. There's got to be a better way. But what are some of those things that organizational leaders and even people within an organization can do to start to recognize, I guess the first thing probably are the opportunity costs, the things they're leaving on the table by just continuing to operate the way they've always operated? How can they start to recognize silos that prevent them from thinking as a holistic organization moving in the same direction versus, okay, here's my digital team, they're responsible for this. Here's my direct marketing team, they're responsible for this. Here's my major gift team, they're responsible for this. And everyone has their own budget. Everyone has their own expense account. Everyone has their own goal and revenue line item tied to it. And, one team may be having a pizza party at the end of the quarter and the other team may be kicking the can, right?
Yeah.
And so how have you helped organizations or mentored leaders to start thinking differently, acting differently, and moving their organizations into, this quote unquote better way, right?
Yeah. So I think, one of the most recent examples of this, and I didn't really have anything to do with it. I was along for the ride and provided some strategy support, but Dan Karp and Lindsay Maurer over at Covenant House International, they think this way already, right? And so when I got involved with them a year or so ago, one of the things that was most exciting to me is they said, look, we have, 4, 5, 6 different disparate teams that they had inherited when they joined the organization, and they were working to tie them all together. And one of the first things they said was we're not going to have separate budgets now. We're definitely going to do, bottom up budgeting so that we know what everything costs and what the potential returns are. But we want to maintain a flexible enough nature that, hey, if this channel is working really well, we're just going to shift money over there, right? If that program is delivering twice what we expected, then we're going to take budget from something that's not delivering and we're going to push it there. And the same thing around how they think about talent and deploying resources internally. And that's the kind of mindset that I think leaders need to really do this well, is to say, look, we might have people who have expertise in certain areas. Do I need somebody who's an email expert? Probably, maybe, depending on what you're doing. Do I need someone who's a major gift, has got major gift expertise? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You need someone who can build those relationships and make those asks. But at the end of the day, you've got to be flexible. And the worst thing we can do is to say, nope, we're going to do it this way because we said 12 months ago we're going to do it this way. The world, as we've seen over the last 3 years, the world can change much more quickly than that. And if we aren't set up to be nimble and responsive to that, we're going to have some serious problems. I think some of the other examples that I've seen recently are things like creating shared KPIs, right? So one of the bigger challenges, I was working with an organization a couple of years ago, and they were trying to raise an incremental additional $1 million in a 4-month period, right? And so we said, okay, well, one of the fastest ways to do that is let's do an asset ask campaign where we literally are going out and we're saying to donors, if you've never given to us through your donor advised fund before, or through your IRA account, or through your stock portfolio, there's a match opportunity, and there's this, we're raising money for this specific objective. Would you please consider giving from one of those 3 ways? Because we know that as soon as somebody does that, they're going to give a bigger gift than they would if they give cash. And otherwise, a really smart and savvy team said, well, those gifts are credited to a different department. So we're not going to do that because, and we believe that it would work, but we're not going to do it because we won't get credit. So we won't even hit the $1 million goal that we need to meet. And, that was one where I just sat back and I thought, wow, talk about getting in your own way, right? If the mission needs an extra $1 million, who gives a rip what bucket it ends it up in, right? Like we shouldn't care. And if I drive revenue, but it falls in your P&L because of the way the fund codes map in the CRM and the finance software, neither of us should get penalized for that. We ought to have a collaborative set of KPIs that say, there were drivers and there were converters, and we worked together to build the biggest pie possible, right? But when organizations think from a finance first perspective and from an operations first perspective, rather than from a donor first perspective, you get that kind of artificial framework that keeps people from doing their best work. And so I think, at a minimum, if we started to break down those barriers, I think organizations would raise a ton more money because those disincentives for behaviors that we want would be removed.
Right. So I don't think you and I have ever talked about this before, but I have a working theory that a lot of the issues nonprofit leaders are facing today are inherited because of the broader nonprofit industry culture. And I've spent many years as a consultant in the nonprofit sector. And one of the things that I saw as a consultant is most consultants in the sector know what works really well for exactly what they're doing. Most consultants in the sector are involved in fundraising, typically direct marketing. That's probably the biggest sector of consulting. Yes, there's talent consulting and leadership consulting and things like that. But I would say the biggest network of consulting is specifically to help organizations raise more funds. So you have consultants who are paid a lot, who everyone listens to because they're supposed to be the expert in the room, telling organizations, you need to fundraise this way. You need to do direct marketing this way. And my theory here is that the combination of a more traditional mindset of, finance first, process first, with the voice of the consultant leaning into, okay, here's how we succeed in that model, has created an expectation that, if we're going to invest in fundraising, we're going to invest in this very specific thing first, because that's how we know how to succeed. And then everything else is kind of nice to have, right? So I'm going to turn the tables and ask you to unpack that a little bit, see you get your take on it, but also ask you a pointed question. Is like, if an organization is listening to this and like, hey, I need to change the way I do things. The way I'm doing it is not sustainable anymore. And I don't know that I know where to go to find help to do that. Where could someone go?
So I largely agree with your premise. And I think we need to look no further than the nonprofit conference circuit to see all of the various quote unquote best practice seminars that arguably are more along the lines of average practices and largely the practices that you can get the lowest common denominator of organizations to adopt, right? That doesn't make them best. That just makes them most frequent, right? And, particularly when you start talking about marketing agencies that serve nonprofits, and we're doing a lot at Dickerson Bakker to kind of upend this model. But I firmly believe that one of the biggest impediments to real net revenue growth for organizations is that when they choose an agency partner, when they go through an RFP process, they're not asking the right questions. And so I've been in the agency world for decades, but I've also been on the nonprofit side. I was a buyer of those services when I ran development at a children's hospital. And what I learned, and what I've learned over the decades, is your consulting partner's business model matters a heck of a lot more than you realize. So case in point, if I am incentivized as a consultant to sell you more print because I have printing presses and in order for me to be profitable, those have to run all day, right? Then every problem starts to look like a problem for which the solution is print more, right? Whereas if my value to you as a consultant is in helping you think strategically and helping you spend your investment dollars in the wisest and most profitable ways possible, and maybe that's print, maybe it's headcount for major gift staff, maybe it's a new grant strategy. It could be any number of things, right? But that business model is really important. And if you don't understand how your agency partner makes money, you are susceptible to a lot of risky behavior because you just don't have as much information as they do. So the first place I would start is I would say, do your due diligence and don't just ask somebody for a price comparison. Don't just say, how is your creative different from the next guy's? Ask questions that actually get at things that matter. Like, in this relationship, I understand how I make money. How do you make money, right? And the biggest red flag you're going to get is when an agency says, well, we don't talk about that. Right? Because that, and I've been in that situation where I've heard that response. That tells me everything I need to know that I should run for the hills, right? And, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not anti-profit. I think absolutely organizations and consultants should be able to make a healthy profit. It's one of the best ways to continue to equip the nonprofit industry is to have great consulting partners, right? But we should never set up a scenario where the consultant and the agency make significantly more money than their charitable partners, because at that point our incentives are misaligned, right?
Right.
So I think that's a big one. And then I think also understanding, how we collaborate together to build meaningful change into a program. So one of the most insightful questions that I've seen anybody ask recently, and actually, so Victoria Manoia is on my team. You and I have both worked with her at a couple different shops. She had this question that she asked of an organization recently where she said, in 12 months, if we've worked well together, how will my business and my organization be meaningfully different because of your strategic investment in our work? And that's not just, I'm going to mail more and get you more donors, right? It really is a question about how are our philosophies aligned and how do you see value creation and the transfer of that value creation between our two organizations. So I think, for me, in that entire equation, a lot of it has to do with, I just don't think we're asking the right questions of our partners. And I think we are, I don't know about you, but when I get an RFP, usually it's last minute. And usually I'm lucky if I've got 30 days to respond. And the questions tend to be so basic that I look at it and I think, this could go any one of 19 different ways depending on how the wind blows, versus one that's really strategic and insightful and asks questions that actually get at differentiation versus just putting out a pricing, practice where someone can say, well, I compared 7 different companies' prices and this one was the cheapest, right? And if that's the goal, fine. It's not a relationship I want to get into. But, I think if we're really intentional about asking better questions to get at the things that actually matter, that will drive value for us as a buyer of those services, that's where I think you can really make some meaningful change and start to completely flip the script for organizations.
So ask better questions, be intentional with, and it almost comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where we said, ask better questions of your donors, get to know your donors as people, get to know your partners as people, get to know the people who are literally in it day in and day out with you, and making sure that they're walking not only in the same direction, but at the same pace. I think that's probably the biggest difference is we both may want to see you succeed, but, and this is something, being on the client side now that, being in the brand side, when I ask my partners and when I ask people who consult for us at Funraise, I go, I don't just want you to want me to succeed. I want you to want to succeed with me at the same pace that I want to succeed. And if you can't, or you won't, or you don't, then this probably isn't a relationship that's going to be fruitful for either of us, because I'm going to expect more from you than you want to give me. And I'm going to be consistently frustrated because I'm going to feel like I'm undervalued or unimportant.
Yeah.
So I think that's a critical piece.
That's a really good point. I mean, so I had this conversation recently with a partner that we're just launching a relationship with. And one of the differentiators I shared with them was, I said, look, we're a growth-focused organization. So if you only want to maintain and you want to grow, a comfortable 2 to 3% a year, there's plenty of companies that can help you with that. That's not us, right? And I'm always going to want to push you to grow more. Not just for the sake of having a bigger budget, but because it's really important to me to be able to actually make impact in the world. And everybody on our team, right? We're all wired the same way. We get out of bed and come to work excited about the idea that, hey, we could help reduce the number of people living in poverty, or the number of people who are suffering from addiction, or whatever the cause might be. And maintaining the status quo does not move the needle one bit.
I love it. That's something we talk a lot about at Funraise too, is we're not the partner for the status quo. We're going to continue to build and iterate and innovate because we want to help you grow, right? Your mission, your impact, the reason your organization exists is far too important to just keep doing what you're already doing. You need to grow in every aspect, grow your reach, grow your impact, grow your people, but also grow your revenue, because that's the catalyst to all the other growth.
So I've said something recently that I think might cause some friction in the industry, and some people might take offense at it, but I mean no personal harm around it. But my perspective is, if your comfort is more important than your mission impact, you're in the wrong job.
Right. Wow. That one is heavy and gonna stick. That may be the slogan for this right. session on our promos. Yeah. If your comfort is more important than your mission impact, then you might be in the wrong place. Wow. All right. Well, Andrew, this has been an awesome conversation. I'm excited to get this episode out and share it with our audience. But before we close, any final thoughts, or, if people listening are, I really want to dig deeper. I want to, I have questions about what Andrew was saying about this or that. Is there a good way for someone to reach out to you, to connect with you, to learn more about, you or Dickerson Bakker or anything like that?
Yeah, I'd love that. Welcome the conversation. So I'm on LinkedIn all the time. That's the easiest place for people to hit me up. But if you want to come to me directly, my cell is 612-201-1967. Call or text anytime. Well, within reason, not 2 a.m.
Although you might be up with the cows on the right night.
Might. Cows or kids, either one.
All right, Andrew. Well, thank you for your time. This has been an awesome conversation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Amen. Thanks, David. Always appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Nonstop Nonprofit. This podcast is brought to you by your friends at Funraise, nonprofit fundraising software built for nonprofit people by nonprofit people. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find me on LinkedIn or text me at 714-717-2474. And don't forget to get your next episode the second it hits the internets. Find us on your favorite podcast streaming service, hit that follow button, and leave us a review to help us reach more nonprofit people like you. See you next time.